sermon preached on the first day of Passover, 1968, Saturday, the 13th of April.
I would like to wish all of you a happy Pesach. In the olden days, it used to be a kosher Pesach. We can say that too, as long as we are not thinking merely of the meticulous preoccupations with the halachic minutiae, which are important within a context and a framework. A kosher Pesach, that's the way we used to say it, when we over 30s were under 30 some years ago. A happy Pesach, and now the purveyors of Manischewitz wine have reintroduced a decent Pesach for all Jews and Gentiles in New York City to participate in, and that's nice too. Happy, kasher, or sweet. Surely the essence of the Seder service, which I hope all of you enjoyed last night and will enjoy this evening, is the spirit of peace and reconciliation which hovers over the home. The prophet Malachi, from whom we read on Shabbat Hagadol, the Sabbath before Passover, anticipates the universalistic theme of Passover in his prophetic teaching, "Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why do we therefore deal treacherously, every man against his brother?" And the Haftarah of the Shabbat Hagadol, which we read last Shabbat, ends with a reference to the prophet Elijah, who, before he will bring about the redemption, before he will announce the coming redemption, Veheshiv Lev Avot al Banim, the Lev Banim al Avotam, will restore the hearts of fathers to children and the hearts of children to their fathers. Somehow the prophet seems to see the nub, the nucleus of the universalistic challenge of Passover. Freedom in the home, the domestic hearth, the Seder table, where on those rare occasions nowadays the family actually gathers together for a sacred meal to discuss with each other what it means to be a Jew. The reconciliation and peace of the Seder night, the refraction of the universalistic dream of the prophet. All men children of one God, and this universalism achieved through the particularism of reconciliation within the family. I noticed that the quotation of the day in the New York Times this morning was by Dr. Grayson Kirk, the president of Columbia. And he says, "I know of no time in our history when the gap between the generations has been wider or more potentially dangerous." I suppose we could translate Elijah's blessing, which I ask upon all of us here today, Veheshiv Lev Avot al Banim, the Lev Banim al Avotam, that there might be reconciliation between parents and children. I suppose we could translate that Hebrew phrase, Veheshiv Lev Avot al Banim, to Elijah will bridge the generation gap. By the way, you know the way Bubba and Zeta used to bridge the generation gap? With a frask in pisk. A decent Pesach, a sweet Passover. That means a slap in the mouth, by the way. A sweet Pesach because always Passover reminds us of maror, of bitterness. Avadim hayinu. We were slaves. The bitterness of our recollection of the past. The long, far ago, far away past of Egypt, 2,500 years ago. and the more recent past. We must never forget that we were slaves. In a few days, on the 25th of April, in Times Square, there will be a mass commemoration of the anniversary of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. Let us not forget the past. The public schools will be closed. Permission will be granted for all those who wish to participate in this anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto to attend. Let us not forget the past. This year, because of the anguish of the Jews in Poland, the commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto will indeed be a protest on behalf not only of those who died in the Warsaw Ghetto, but of the insult to the memory of those who died in the current persecution. Although we must confess an irony that the hand of anti-Semitism now lies heavily on those Jews who ran away from their Judaism and thought that they could escape it in the Communist Party and in other parts of the government. It is sad that we must protest even after the Warsaw Ghetto for those who still cannot see that nothing is to be gained for the Jewish people by running away from their past. The price, perhaps, is greater when one runs away than when one stands and fights meaningfully. At our table last night, and I hope at yours, there was a symbol which commenced only last year, a separate setting for 3 million Russian Jews, a separate piece of matzah, so that the children, in addition to the questions they ask about everything else on Seder night, can say, why is there a special chair and a special plate and a special knives and forks and a piece of matzah? What is it there for? And the answer is because there are 3 million Russian Jews who are not able to live fully as Jews. Now let us be fair with our children and ourselves. Russia is not Nazi Germany. And the Jews in Russia are not being treated the way in which the Nazis treated the Jews. One might almost say that in a sense there is almost an ideological justification in terms of communism for what the Russians are doing. From their point of view, not from ours. We plead and we pray and we dedicate our efforts through this symbol of the extra piece of matzah and the extra setting, that one day the Russian people might see that when an ethnic minority such as the Jews are permitted to fulfill their own ethnic destiny, then that people contributes far more to the people which is host to it than is obtained by oppression and by persecution. We pray through the symbol of the separate piece of matzah that the Russian Jew may be permitted to fulfill the implications. Some of you may have heard the thousands of young Jews paraded last night outside the synagogue of Moscow. Elie Wiesel tells us that these Jews are ignorant. They know no Hebrew, they know no songs, they know nothing about Judaism. They are drawn magnetically towards the synagogue on the eve of Pesach. But the place to celebrate Pesach authentically is not the street. It is not a mass demonstration, our Passover celebration. It is a family celebration. And we hope and pray that in years to come, Russian Jews will be permitted to celebrate their Pesach in home. We have the cup of the wandering Jew, the cup of Elijah on our table, which symbolizes for us the wanderings of the Jew, the diaspora people throughout the ages, that our existence in any country at any time is dependent on the moral climate of that country, that the Jew is the first to go when the barometer of civilization falls. The cup of Elijah, the wandering Jew. In many homes, as in ours, and as we shall have at the congregational Seder this evening, there were 6 candles, in addition to the candles we light for Shabbat and Yom Tov. 6 candles symbolizing the 6 million Jews who died in the most terrible Holocaust ever to fall upon the Jewish people, with their history of Holocausts. And in the prayer Lashana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, this year above all we anticipate that despite the victory of last year, there is not yet a firm and lasting peace in Israel. We pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that next year indeed Jerusalem may be the golden city of true peace. And this year, in addition, we think not only of the Polish Jews and the Russian Jews and of the Jews in Israel, but also of the Egyptian Jews caught up in the fight between Egypt and Israel and made to suffer terribly. They're suffering no less because it is so inconspicuous, relatively speaking, because of their limited numbers, in the mass of suffering, the millions of multiples we are used to accept in the modern world. Egyptian Jews hounded into prison, subjects of Egypt with Egyptian passports, treated as outcasts, tormented, tortured, and persecuted. For all these Jews, Pesach cries out this year, Shalach ami v'ya'avduni, let my people go, that they may serve me. But an additional tragedy this year hangs over us as American Jews, tugging at our heartstrings. This year, all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten the maror, the acrid fumes left hanging over this great and populous democracy from the assassin's rifle. As we think of the maror in all countries, the maror experienced and by all Jews and which all Jews are forced to consume, especially at this time of the year, not all the charoset will temper the sharp taste of anguish that we American Jews must experience with our fellow men in this great democracy over the death of Martin Luther King. Pesach will never be the same again, and perhaps some new symbol should be introduced into our American observance of the Seder service to indicate the tragedy which has befallen on us this week and last week. My interest in the emancipation of the Negro is purely selfish. I need the Negro's humanity for my own. I find that I cannot be fulfilled as an American Jew unless the Negro is also fulfilled. We live in two civilizations. This is a phrase which those who visit Reconstructionist synagogues hear very often. What that means in terms of Reconstructionist theory is that if we cannot be authentic Americans, we cannot be authentic Jews. And if we cannot be authentic Jews, we cannot be authentic Americans. What we gain from one ethnic tradition, we lend to the other. There is an interchange. When there is sickness in our relationship to one of the two civilizations to which we belong, then we are sick as Jews. Reconstructionism does not tolerate an enclave theory, a Spring Valley theory. You cannot be a Jew in the ghetto in 20th century democratic life. Whether the ghetto is Spring Valley or Brooklyn or Scarsdale and White Plains, we must be involved in the ongoing life of all Americans. We have a moral responsibility to all Americans, else we do not fulfill a moral responsibility to ourselves. Any Seder service which was tarnished last night in any way by racist thoughts, by indifference to the plight and anguish of the Negro, by a shrug of relief that it was all over and now business was back to usual, was no Seder service. It was a blasphemy. We have asked you in this congregation to send us contributions in memory of Martin Luther King. We have suggested that every member of the congregation tries to give approximately $10, although we will certainly not turn away larger or smaller contributions. Many of you have already replied to my letter of a day or so ago. Some of you indicated you had already given, and I know you are generous. But God bless you, you gave again because you wanted to participate with us of the SAJ as a unit. It was suggested to the Board of Trustees, and I think it's a beautiful idea, that as an SAJ community, we try to just put a little drop in the bucket, something little tangible as a community, that we send one Negro boy through college. If every member of this congregation gave approximately $10, we could do precisely that. And if you happen to be here this morning and you're not a member of our congregation, then for this purpose, I declare that you are a member of this congregation. And checks may be made out to the SAJ and sent to me at the synagogue. Of course, it's a drop in the bucket. But we need that Negro student going through college on our money more than the Negro people, and that Negro student needs it. We need the physical freedom of the Negro for our own moral freedom. We shall send, by the way, a list of names of all those who contributed to the SCLC, and the total sum, I hope proudly, will be announced in the bulletin. Some years ago, I went to see a play by Christopher Fry called The Firstborn in England. So long ago, I can't even remember the play. It's a good play. If we had more time, maybe one year we should try to do a little bit of it in synagogue on Passover. I can remember just one scene where Pharaoh, it's late at night, and Moses is trying to reason with Pharaoh. Look, Pharaoh, we can't carry on like this anymore. You can't keep a people in slavery like this anymore. You've got to let us go. Pharaoh says, look, Moses, I'm busy. I have all these state papers to read through before tomorrow morning. And I have a meeting at 9, and a meeting at 10, and a meeting at 11. I know you have a problem, but there are so many other things to do. I am Pharaoh. I am ruler of this vast country, and I have many other priorities. And now, Moses, I am tired, and if you will forgive me, please let me go to sleep. I hope Christopher Fry will permit my interpretation of what I remember now, 15 years after having seen the play. Let me go to sleep, Pharaoh says. And Moses replies, and I think I remember these words correctly, a fiery Moses with a beard and eyes flashing. Pharaoh has just said that he wants to go to sleep. He's too tired to hear what Moses has to say about an enslaved people. And Moses says to him, Pharaoh, let no man sleep till everyone can sleep. Perhaps Moses, at this moment in Jewish history, in America, would say to the Jew who says to the Negro, look, I sympathize with you, I'm terribly upset, believe me, I cried when I heard the news, but I'm sorry, I have a date at home, I've got to go home, my family are having a Seder service, I've got to get back there. Conceivably, Moses, through the Negro, would have said to the Jew, let no one sit down to celebrate the festival of freedom till all men can sit down to celebrate the festival of freedom. Well, we had interesting things happening this week. I want to read you one advertisement in the New York Times which caught my fancy. Levitt pays tribute to Dr. King in deed, not empty phrases. Permit me to read this into the record. For many years, Levitt and Sons write, our housing policy has been to abide by local law or custom. Accordingly, there have been Levitt communities that have been integrated and others that were not. During those years, however, we have constantly urged both the executive and legislative areas of government to take action, making desegregation the law of the land. Our policy has been a matter of record in testimony before congressional committees and White House meetings. So far, there is no law or executive order eliminating segregation in the United States. And we shall not wait any longer for such action to occur. As a tribute to Dr. King, this company has adopted a new policy, effective at once, eliminating segregation any place it builds, whether it be the United States or any other country in the world. We ask all our colleagues to adopt a similar policy without delay. The forces of bigotry and prejudice must not be permitted to prevail any longer, and we urge all builders, large and small alike, to do their part in making America once again the ideal of the world. We congratulate Levitt and Sons. I am sure that it is easier for a company of their size to make such a magnanimous gesture than perhaps a smaller company. But was it necessary even for the Levitts of our land to wait until Martin Luther King died? We have seen this week a civil rights bill passed in indecent haste which might never have passed without Martin Luther King being killed. The words of Bernard Shaw at the end of the play St. Joan burn in our ears. Must then a Christ perish in torment in every age to save those that have no imagination? Do the pens which sign the bills of every act of progressive legislation in this country have to be dipped in the blood of martyrs? At this coincidence in the calendar of Easter and Pesach, perhaps it would be easier to be a Christian than a Jew. According to Reconstructionism, religions differ the way languages differ rather than the way propositions differ. It's not a question of Judaism being true or false and Christianity being true or false, but Judaism being better for Jews and Christianity being better for Christians, the way English is better for English-speaking people and French better for French-speaking people, unless you have an urge to swap. It seems to me that religions are languages in which ethnic groups communicate, not about cats sitting on mats, but about the more abstract, value, remote, ethereal areas of human life. It seems to me that Christianity is particularly rich in its elegy for the great individual leader crucified on behalf of the sins of others. As with the late John F. Kennedy, so with Martin Luther King, Christianity seems to be a more fitting framework to express his agony and ours. On the transatlantic television, Christopher Mayhew had just been to a performance of the St. Matthew Passion at the Royal Festival Hall and said, one really could identify, this was what was happening in America. One identified with the man, the central figure who was crucified. Well, I suppose you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy St. Matthew Passion, although I must confess I enjoy it much less now since the Holocaust, when one is aware a little more of the relationship between Christianity and the concentration camps. But it is true that Christianity expresses its main symbolism and its main mythology through the individual hero who is crucified, whereas Judaism is very strong on the first person plural. We, Amacha, peoplehood. Professor Heschel of the Jewish Theological Seminary, I think, made a most unfortunate choice when, in the presence of some 110 million viewers, he selected the 53rd chapter of Isaiah as a scriptural reading at the Morehouse College funeral, that section of the funeral which took place in the open air at Morehouse College. By the way, I think the choice of Heschel to read it was also unfortunate, because I somehow feel that after so many years of American Jews being in America, the image which should represent to the Gentile, especially to the Negro, what the Jew stands for, should not be the caricature stereotype, which Professor Heschel, in spite of himself, and there's no reflection on him, public relations is one thing and reality is something else. All the goodwill in the world could not make me feel that visually and auditorially this was a most untypical Jew who should not have been presented in the presence of 110 million people. But of course, as we have always complained as Reconstructionists, the Jewish people is not organized in this country, and when any crisis of this kind happens, no one knows who to send and no one knows who to go. Professor Heschel presented himself to the Pope some years ago as the spokesman for World Jewry without being asked. And no one knows how the Jewish people can ever get to the blissful stage when it can truly have a representative. I suggest we might take a leaf out of the British jury's book and have a revolving chief rabbi. I don't mean a chief rabbi who goes around, but a chief rabbi who is a chief rabbi, not just an executive secretary of some organization, but that a man should be elected to serve for no longer a period than 2 years. One rabbi who would be called upon to represent the 5 million Jews in America in the sight of the Gentile community. I don't care who selects this, but some representative should exist. Now, Dr. Heschel is a great man and has contributed greatly to the civil rights movement and has participated more than many other rabbis in this work, but that still does not make him our best representative on such an occasion. Who represents the American Jew? Who determines? There were many Jews there, but there did not seem to be any rhyme or reason. Now, the second unfortunate aspect was his choice of Isaiah 53, because the understanding of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 who was despised and forsaken of men, a man of pains and acquainted with disease, who was despised and we esteemed him not, who bore our diseases and carried our pains, who was smitten of God and afflicted, who was wounded because of our transgressions. By the way, I'm the last one to talk about the problem of an accent. I'm merely saying that there is an American community which needs an American representation. He was crushed because of our iniquities. With his stripes we were healed. He was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, although he had done no violence. Now the problem there is that there is no Jewish source that I know of that gives an individualistic interpretation to the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. All Jewish commentators, unequivocally, regard the suffering servant collectively as the people of Israel. And by reading this chapter in this context, Dr. Heschel, it must have been wittingly, because no one knows more about the Bible than Dr. Heschel, chose to use the Hebrew Bible to give a Christological reading, which I, for one, felt uncomfortable with. The suffering servant is not the individual hero. He is the people as a whole. But that's why I say that Judaism has very little to offer for the crucified individual, and perhaps the idiom of Christianity is better at this time of the year to express the tragedy we have experienced. So the paradox was that the Negro Abernathy read our Bible more effectively and with greater dignity. It may well be that the death of Martin Luther King was personal and can best be described in the Christian myth. But we Jews know of the peoplehood experience, and there are things that can be said about the funeral of Martin Luther King which can best be conveyed in our idiom of Amacha Yisrael. Of the revelation on Mount Sinai, we read, Vayichan Yisrael neget hahar. Israel encamped before the mountain. And the rabbis say, why does it not say in the plural, Vayachanu Yisrael? Why Vayichan Yisrael in the singular? To which the rabbis say, there was unity. Ki ish echad, belev echad. As one man with one heart. That is the impact on many of us of the manner in which the funeral of Martin Luther King was commemorated, especially in the church and at Morehouse College. The whole host of the Jewish people left Egypt on that self-same day. There was something in the unity of the marches which must have impressed everyone who watched on television. And we, by the way, should remind ourselves that even in the case of the Exodus from Egypt, there were many Jews who were not aspiring for the redemption, who did not want to cooperate with our ancestors in the Exodus from Egypt. And rabbinic tradition tells us that these Jews who did not share the aspirations of the masses of the Israelites in Egypt died during the 3 days of darkness so that they could be buried and not be a source of aggravation to the Jewish people as a whole. Unfortunately, those Negroes who do not share the aspirations of the Negro people are visible on television, are not blessed with the miracle of having to cope with their minority of disturbers of the peace in the darkness of 3 days. We are all going to have to revise our stereotypes of the Negro. The footloose Negro, the lazy Negro, the drunk Negro, the incompetent Negro. We are all of us, perhaps Jews especially, going to have to revise our stereotypes, just as we would wish the stereotypes of ourselves should be revised by other people. What the Negro community did by themselves, the way they organized the march, the way they organized the funeral, was with such dignity as I have rarely seen, even in a funeral organized by a great state with all the paraphernalia of a great state. The individual faces of Negro men and women on television, like so many Rembrandts. Stabat Mater Dolorosa, the dignity of the mother and the father of the martyred man in the face of 110 million people. The thoughtfulness, even under stress, to be thoughtful at such a moment and think that it was hot and it was crowded and therefore 10 or 12 speeches should be cancelled. And no one was broigus. I want to make no invidious comparisons. No one was upset because they were asked not to speak. Hast du gehört etwas in a Jewish situation? I don't want to be self-critical, but perhaps we should. Can you see no one looked miserable because they hadn't been allowed to have a field day? 12 speeches were cancelled. And it went on. And the man thought of this when his son lay dead in front of him. And Mrs. King, happy the people that create such a woman with such dignity. We white Anglo-Saxon Jews had thought that Jacqueline Kennedy embodied all the graces. And now the grandchildren of slaves have taught us a lesson. They buried him from Ebenezer Church, and most of the seats were reserved for the congregation, although the greatest dignitaries of the world stood outside. I hope we could have done the same thing. The dignitaries stood outside, but those simple people who organized this funeral felt instinctively that it was right that those who had supported him in life should be with him at death. When Ben-Gurion visited this country, I understand that it was almost impossible for the students to get anywhere near him. He met the big donors to UJA. He met the machers, the knackers. But the common man in the street is past nicht. And this is what happened when the great Jew visited our country. But at Ebenezer Church, the bulk of the seats were taken by the poor Negroes who supported Martin Luther King in life. What dignity there was at that service. What a natural quality in the prayers. What eloquence in the eulogies. I don't have much experience of marches. I can only compare the march I saw on television last week with the march I participated in Washington in connection with the Six-Day War in Israel. I want to tell you, folks, that 24 organizations organized the march in Washington. The public address system broke down, and I was embarrassed by late in the afternoon that I had inveigled my congregation to send 2 busloads of people down because they were sitting around listlessly. No one was organizing anything. And we've been around a long time. And I looked at the chairman of the synagogue, and he looked at me, and we both felt distinctly embarrassed that we had been told that 24 organizations were planning something in Washington. And there was more time then to plan. And there was no organization. I thrilled spiritually to the choir. I announced more in sorrow than in anger that there will be no choir singing in this synagogue tomorrow, because our professional singers on Easter Sunday will be singing in church. With all our great Gedula and Gevura and Gewalt about Jewish music and Reconstructionism, I don't know what the reason is, we still do not have Jewish choristers who are committed Jews who can sing in a synagogue all days, not just when, unfortunately, Easter Sunday coincides with Pesach, and we have to take second place. The value of Gentiles in any case singing Jewish prayers from phonetic English in a synagogue such as ours is a problem which worries me anyway and has worried me for years, and there's no point in my beating about the bush. We have wonderful singers. They have wonderful voices. They are wonderful human beings. But there is a problem of religious music as opposed to technical music, which I cannot resolve in my own conscience. There was a woman, an unknown woman in that chapel at Ebenezer, and she sang a Negro spiritual. She wasn't brought in just for the occasion because she had a sweet voice and was internationally renowned because of that sweet voice. She sang every week in that choir. And the announcer said, this woman, they didn't even know her name. She was anonymous. We didn't know who she was. And she sang from the heart. And then the announcer said, this was the favorite hymn of Martin Luther King. He heard it so often in the church from her mouth. And that is why she was able to give that kind of feeling. I feel that we are doing something wrong. Maybe we aren't providing a big enough budget. Maybe we Jews as a whole, Reconstructionists, talk about Jewish music, but do not realize that there is a place for a Jewish, involved, committed choir singing Hebrew within the framework of a synagogue 365 days of the year, so that there can be the overtones that we heard in this spiritualist singer's voice. Of course, I am speaking of the choir. I am not speaking of our cantor, who in his own rendering of the Jewish music adds the technical excellence and perfection to the Yiddish neshama, for which one truly has to be a Jew. Later, they got an outstanding Negro singer, Mahalia Jackson. I don't know. You must have watched this as I did. We saw the Negro people in public speaking their heart. I have never been so deeply moved. But I had to remember, in all fairness to myself, that when we met together in the Madison Square Garden some years ago, on behalf of Russian Jewry, the man chosen by the organizers to sing one item on behalf of all those Jews who were gathered there was Cantor Kuzovitsky. And some of you were there and heard his rendition of El Mali Rachamim, and it was painful. It was an exhibitionist coloratura of the old Third Avenue type, which those of you who have heard the Third Avenue, is it Third Avenue? I'm not that much of an American. Second Avenue, all right, so one avenue, difference makes this. Those of you who are not there, pass no judgment. Those of you who were there in Madison Square Garden, and those of you who watch television this week, you make the judgment. Now the press in this country prints the scandal, the rape and the arson and the loot and the burning. It's good news and it sells papers. If you read the Haggadah carefully last night, you will observe, Vayenatzlu et Mitzrayim, our ancestors also had the equivalent of a Watts revolt when they left Egypt. They spoiled the Egyptians. Vayetzu birchush gadol, they went out with great substance. Now the rabbis say, well, the reason why they took it all from the Egyptians was because they said, we've been working for you for all these years and we've been underpaid, so now we have a right to chop it. But it wasn't strictly within the letter of the law, and the argument in the minds of some of those simple Negroes who break in shop windows is exactly the same. You fiddled us and swindled us for years, so now we're helping ourselves. And they go out birchush gadol. Please, if you missed that little point in the Haggadah, read it again. We know the Negroes have their battens, so do we Jews. But we saw the Amacha on television, and you can't keep the truth from the people all the time, even though the nasty bits of information about the Negroes sell the newspapers. We saw a whole people, ki ish echad belev echad, as one man with one heart. Ki hinei enechem haroot, your eyes beheld it. The elected representative, the governor of Georgia, when he was asked why he was working on Tuesday, said, we never close on Tuesday. And the face of Coretta King was the answer which the Negro people gave to that supreme example of American liberalism. Christianity sees death and resurrection this weekend. We can imagine what is going on tomorrow in the Ebenezer Chapel, the rising of the resurrected Jesus. Others will be his immortality for the Christian. We see a people united, strong in resolve to achieve its inevitable destiny. A Negro Haggadah will yet be written, which will give a central role to Martin Luther King. We Reconstructionists have included in the Haggadah Shel Pesach Moses, whose name is absent from the traditional Haggadah. There is no reference whatsoever to Moses in the traditional Haggadah. And yet in Dr. Kaplan's Haggadah, the name of Moses has been put in again. Why? Because the humanistic rendition of the Haggadah takes the centrality from God and places it squarely with the Jewish people. Moses was a great leader. We are not ashamed to say so. And therefore, Moses must have a central role in our Reconstructionist Haggadah. Even so, Negroes will one day pray the equivalent of Avadim Hayinu Bi'artzot Habrit Vayotzienu Martin Luther King Misham, the redemption from Egypt on the part of a great man under God. Pesach will never be the same again, not for American Jews, nor for sensitive Jews world over. This American was an international symbol of peace. And some of you may have read reports in foreign newspapers this week, which indicate not only that this man was respected more in America than in Atlanta, but that he was respected more in the world at large than even in America. Like Eleanor Roosevelt, he was fiercely American, but he belonged to humanity, an ethnic prophet with a universal message. Nothing is more universal than the theme which Pesach celebrates. It is Zaman Cherutenu, and yet nothing is more particularist than the way in which we celebrate it. All the spring symbols of the other religions are there. The lamb, the egg, the new flower, the parsley, the herbs. All these have been dipped in the cauldron of ethnic history and given specifically Jewish meaning. But the ethnic dimension of Pesach is not meant to blind us to its universality. On the contrary, it is meant precisely to heighten our awareness of that universality. And if one purpose of Pesach is to remind us of the fact that Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh, another equally important one is to remind us that Avadim Anachnu, we are still slaves so long as any man is a slave. Pray God that our ethnic and particularist celebration of the universal theme of freedom, through time-honored tastes, smells, sights, and sounds, lead us to dedicate our souls and our substance to the release from bondage of all men, so that black and white, Jew and Gentile, Polish Jew, Russian Jew, Egyptian Jew, Israeli Jew, all mankind might echo in one mighty paean the words of that old Negro song, which in the first person singular are emblazoned on Martin Luther King's last resting place, words with which he loved to conclude his own speeches. A paean, a mighty paean echoing from all mankind, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Please rise. I suggested that a symbol should be used in our Passover celebration to commemorate what we American Jews have gone through this week. I have asked you to rise, and I ask you in deep empathy with the Negro people, on whose full emancipation our own spiritual well-being and our own celebration of Passover is dependent, and with whose legitimate aspirations for complete freedom, the freedom of all men, is ultimately inexorably bound. Let us sing 3 verses of We Shall Overcome together, a custom which we introduced into our own home yesterday evening, shortly before the door was opened for Elijah, which we shall do in years to come. For this song has become a holy song for the American people. This year, a new American cadence has been mixed with the Passover cadences, and for all men who earnestly seek freedom for themselves and for others. Let us sing together. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome some. We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, we shall all be free someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace. Now, our choir will sing an ancient Jewish version of that self-same universalistic theme of We Shall Overcome, Karev Yom Asher Lo Yom V'Lo Laila, a prayer for the coming of the Messiah, which in its supernaturalistic idiom translates, we shall overcome to the ancient idiom of God shall overcome. Karev yom, asher hu lo yom v'lo laila. Please be seated. Page 382.